Hey guys, this video is all about macromolecules. I'm going to go into what macromolecules are made of, how they're built, and what some of them have in common and what they don't have in common, and what's really important to know about the four major biological macromolecules. So to start the video off, I'm going to list, okay, what are the four major biological macromolecules? So these are molecules that you'll see and hear me talk about throughout the semester, and that is going to be carbohydrates. We've got lipids, we have proteins, and we have nucleic acids. These are the four major macromolecules because they make up a lot of our cells, and they have a lot of different functions and structures. So I'm going to go through each individual macromolecule, but first I do want to talk about what do these macromolecules have in common, and that is how we build them and how we break them down. So let's look at some general vocabulary for macromolecules, and then we'll get into the specifics of how our carbs and lipids and proteins and nucleic acids all different from one another. So let's start by talking about how macromolecules are built. So you can see here we have a string of monomers, which is a polymer. So each individual blue dot or ball is going to be what's called a monomer. So think single, mono means one. So this would be a monomer. This, when they're strung together, is called a polymer. So think polymer is many monomers strung together. But how do we string them together? Well, in order to add this monomer to this polymer here, we have to do what's called a dehydration reaction. So what that means is in order to string this monomer and bind it to this polymer here, water has to be lost. So think when you're dehydrated, you've lost water. So in this case, in order to form a bond between these two separate monomers, right, or to add this monomer onto this entire polymer, to join these two, you have to lose a water molecule. So you can see here we've joined this monomer onto the polymer. So now instead of being 3 monomers in this polymer, we have 4. And to make this bond here, we've released a water, and that is what a dehydration reaction does. In order to build a bond between monomers, you have to lose a water molecule. And when we string monomers together, that is going to create polymers. So we'll see what polymers are for carbs and nucleic acids and proteins in a second. But it is important to know that to build a complex carb, to build an enzyme, to build a strand of DNA, which are all macromolecules, you have to have a dehydration reaction. And this is actually anabolic because we're building bonds. We are building something complex from something a little less complex, or taking these pieces and piecing them together. And remember, anabolic reactions are something that builds bonds. Or so on the flip side, we have how are bonds broken. So if we want to break the bond between these two monomers here, so this is one big polymer right now, but what if we want to break this piece off? So in order to break a bond, we actually have to add a water in, and then that will actually break the bond right here. So what happens is you add this water in, and you're going to get a situation like this, where this has now been broken apart. And the whole concept behind adding the water in, it actually adds a hydrogen onto this monomer and an OH onto this. And that's a little bit beyond what you need to know, but I do like to show you so you can visualize, okay, where did that water go? Did it disappear? What happened to it? Well, you can see HHO. So this is your H2O right here. And this is called hydrolysis. And hydrolysis is when a bond is broken by adding a water. So in this case, we're breaking bonds. So this is what's called a catabolic reaction, which means we're taking pieces, taking something whole, and we're going to break it into pieces. And that happens using hydrolytic enzymes, which are catabolic enzymes that actually do hydrolysis. Anabolic enzymes would do dehydration reactions. So now let's look at our more specific macromolecules, starting with carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, we'll start with the structure. And the structure means what is it made of? So there are 3 elements that make up all carbohydrates. So those are going to be carbon, hydrogen, or oxygen, or I like to just abbreviate it CHO. So remember, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are 3 of our 4 major elements that make up all living matter. So carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen make up all carbohydrates, and the monomer, or the building block for carbohydrates, is called a monosaccharide. And the biggest example of a monosaccharide is a molecule called glucose, or C6H12O6. So glucose being the monomer building block, we can actually string glucoses together and create a polymer, which is, in this case, a polysaccharide. So the main example of a polysaccharide that I talk about is starch. Now, animals do make something called glycogen, which we as human beings actually make in our liver. But for the simplicity of carbohydrates, we're going to focus on, okay, what do plants do? Which is they take the glucose they make in photosynthesis, which I'm going to get to in a second, and they string all of them together and store them in starch molecules. So starch is just a bunch of glucoses strung together. So where are these carbohydrates actually made? Well, as animals and as a human, I can't make glucose. I can't make carbohydrates. I get my carbs from when I eat food, which carb-heavy foods are going to be like bread. They're going to be like things with anything with flour, plant-based matter, because where carbohydrates are synthesized or created is inside of the chloroplast. So they're synthesized in photosynthesis, and then that only happens in plants in the chloroplast. So that sums up the structure of carbohydrates and where they're made. So what is a carbohydrate's function? Function just means what something does. So in this case, carbohydrates, their main function that you need to know is that they represent short-term energy. And how we get that energy from carbohydrates is we actually break them down in the mitochondria and turn them into ATP. And all eukaryotic organisms have a mitochondria. So animals, plants, fungi all break down glucose into ATP in the mitochondria. But don't get that confused, because plants are the only organisms on Earth that have the ability to turn sunlight into food in their chloroplasts. So food being glucose. So carbohydrates, they're made in the chloroplasts, and they are broken down into ATP in the mitochondria. And that sums up the main structure of carbohydrates. So now we can move on to the next macromolecule, which is our lipids. So lipids are weird in that they don't have a true monomer or polymer, because there's different types of lipids that you need to know. So in terms of structure, different lipids are going to be built different ways, but they all have one thing in common. All lipids are non-polar. And everything that's non-polar that means that it is a covalent bond where the electrons are shared equally. And that creates a no charge. So nonpolar molecules have no charge, and that makes them hydrophobic, meaning they don't mix with water or polar molecules or charged molecules. So we'll see in the function how that affects how our cell membrane works, because our cell membrane is actually made of the first type of lipid I want to mention, which is a phospholipid. So phospholipids are weird because they actually have a hydrophilic or water-loving phosphate group, and they have these fatty acid tails, which are nonpolar and hydrophobic. So if fatty acid tails are hydrophobic in lipids, that means that fats, like saturated and unsaturated fats, are also lipids. So the difference between saturated fats and unsaturated is that unsaturated fats have a fatty acid tail that has like a little kink in it, and that prevents these from condensing down. So unsaturated fats tend to be liquid at room temperature, like olive oil, vegetable oils, and saturated fats, no kink, meaning these can condense down, so they tend to be butters and things like that. The structure of fats aren't really as important. I don't get into that too much, but you do need to know that all of these have some sort of non-polar region. So fatty acid tails, hydrophobic, fats, hydrophobic, fats, hydrophobic. So the function, you have two. Our phospholipid here is going to be used to build cell membrane. So because phospholipids are used to build the bilayer, the center of the bilayer where all the fatty acids are is non-polar. And that affects what can pass back and forth between the bilayer. Only non-polar molecules like oxygen gas, O2, and CO2 carbon dioxide, which are actually the gases we breathe in and out, those are examples of molecules that can just pass right back and forth across the bilayer. There's other examples too, but they're not quite as mainstream as oxygen gas and carbon dioxide. Another thing that I forgot to mention actually about this structure is that the elements that make up lipids are going to be the same as carbohydrates, which are CHO. And the organelle that all lipids are created in is going to be the smooth ER. So the smooth ER has no ribosomes, so it doesn't make protein, so it actually detoxifies poison, and it makes our lipids, which is going to be our fatty acids, and then also some like phospholipids as well. So the last function of our lipids that you need to know is that our fats are used for long-term energy. And that's because they actually are a lot more complex than our carbohydrates in terms of how many carbons and hydrogens are in our fats. So it takes a lot of energy to break them down, which is why burning fats off is pretty hard and losing weight's hard. So just think fats, when you store it, they're hard to burn off because they are storing long-term energy. So that brings us to our next macromolecule, which is our awesome proteins. So proteins are a lot more straightforward. They have a true monomer, meaning that they're made of the exact same building block, which in this case is going to be an amino acid. And all proteins are made of the same elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, just like carbs and lipids. However, this time we have two new elements. We have nitrogen, and we have sulfur, which is actually unique to proteins. So carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are going to make up proteins similar to carbs and lipids. Nitrogen is something that proteins share with nucleic acids. However, sulfur is only found in proteins, so make sure you note that. And like I said, their monomer is amino acids. And amino acids are going to be strung together to make a protein. And actually, the polymer for proteins is something called a polypeptide. So a polypeptide is just going to be a string of amino acids, and the organelle that actually synthesizes polypeptides and proteins is called a ribosome. And just make a note that the rough ER has ribosomes, which is what makes it rough ER. So the rough ER also synthesizes or makes proteins as well. So the main function of proteins is that they actually are your cellular workers. So proteins, they make up everything from the traits that you have. They help your immune system fight off disease and infections. And most importantly, proteins make up enzymes. So enzymes are cellular workers that either build molecules or break them down. So they're responsible for speeding up the chemical reactions inside of our body, which makes life possible. Enzymes are elaborated a lot in the metabolism unit, so I'm not going to go into them in detail in this video, but just know enzymes are proteins. Enzymes are made of amino acids, and the amino acids actually help the enzymes have a special shape, which allows them to break and build bonds. So that's it for proteins, which brings us to our final macromolecule, which is going to be our nucleic acids. So nucleic acids are going to be found in the nucleus. So you could think nucleic. Nucleus sounds very similar. And all of our nucleic acids are going to be made out of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, but this time they have phosphate as well, or phosphorus, the element. And this time, phosphate is what is unique to nucleic acids. So just like sulfur is special to proteins, you're only going to find phosphorus in your nucleic acids. You've still got your carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, just like all the other macromolecules. You have nitrogen, which proteins and nucleic acids share, and then you have phosphorus, which is going to be unique to nucleic acids. And nucleic acids are all made of the same monomer, which is a nucleotide. And nucleotides can be strung together into the polymer polynucleotides. And your major examples of nucleic acids and polynucleotides are going to be DNA and RNA. DNA actually never leaves the nucleus. So DNA is actually going to be replicated in the S phase of interphase. And that occurs in the nucleus before the cell divides in mitosis. And RNA is also made in the nucleus. So think the nuclei prefix here is going to be key. The nucleic acids are made of nucleotides, and where they're synthesized is the nucleus. And think the NAs stand for nucleic acid. So DNA is deoxyribose nucleic acid, and RNA is ribonucleic acid. And again, they're both made in the same place, the nucleus. They both share a similar function in that they carry the genetic code. And what that means is that they have the instructions to build proteins. What happens in the cell is that we take a little piece of DNA and make an RNA molecule in the nucleus. And then that RNA can actually leave the nucleus. And then that RNA is going to go to the ribosome where it'll become a protein. So the ribosome reads the RNA and it creates a protein using the instructions which came from the DNA. So DNA can never leave the nucleus, so we have to kind of turn it into RNA in order for it to go into either the rough ER to those ribosomes or the free ribosomes in the cytosol, which is going to make a protein. And that protein will then go to the Golgi to get modified and then shipped out of the cell or perhaps kept in the cell for use. And that protein can be anything from immune system proteins to enzymes to proteins that code for your traits, any of those things I mentioned before in this video. So just know nucleic acids are the instructions for proteins, so that is how they are connected, which is extremely important. And we will definitely have an entire unit where we just talk about DNA, RNA to protein. It comes up now, it comes up in the intermembrane system, and then we actually talk about how that happens. But that's for another time. So this that concludes this video on macromolecules.